Welcome to JW3 Online. We're so glad that you've tuned in, and if you don't know who we are, JW3 are a one-of-a-kind Jewish community centre in London that's open to everyone. If you want to know more about us, like us on Facebook or YouTube, and check out the rest of our events online. We hope you enjoy the programme. Good evening and welcome to Tu B'Shvat Now with Young JW3. I'm Joe Hyman and we've got a great lineup for you this evening. If you joined early and saw our intro, you'll have a sense of what Tu B'Shvat is all about. But this lesser known and brilliant Jewish festival has so much to it. It's the Jewish New Year for trees, and it used to be a time when Jewish people would calculate the age of a fruit tree, as Jewish law asks us to leave trees for 3 years before we take of their fruits. Today, the festival has taken on more meaning. It's a time when people plant trees, celebrate the environment around us, and some, as the facts shared, have a Seder like Pesach, where symbolic fruits are blessed and eaten like tonight. We also raise awareness of climate change and ensuring a future for all, and that's what tonight's all about. We're delighted that tonight's event is also part of the big, bold Jewish Climate Fest. If this is your first JW3 event, make sure to like us on Facebook and join our Young JW3 Facebook group to keep up to date with our program. Our audience is coming in from all over, and we'd love to hear where you're coming from. So let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're celebrating Tu B'Shvat with some fruit, send us a picture in the comments as well. We'd love to see what you're having. We've got a great lineup tonight from across different sectors talking about what matters to them and how they're impacting the environment through their work. Each speaker will present the work that they're doing and how it improves our environment. Our first speaker tonight is one of JW3's valued trustees, and he's a sustainability and impact strategist with over 10 years of experience. He currently works at Deloitte and will be sharing about where this work fits into the larger conversation around the environment. Welcome to the virtual stage, Rafi Addlestone.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody. It's really exciting to be part of this panel and to kick us off today. So as Joe said, I'm Rafi. My day job is working the sustainability and climate change team at Deloitte, and I help big businesses to maximize their positive impact on the world and minimize their negative impacts, particularly when it comes to climate change. Now, in this short 10 minutes that we have together, I'm going to offer a brief overview of how what I do helps clients think through their choices when it comes to climate change and other areas of sustainability, and also offer some reflections for us as citizens and consumers. But first, why does this all matter? What's the context? Well, we're virtually gathered here today because it's Tu B'Shvat, the Jewish New Year for trees, and our community's annual opportunity to reflect through the prism of our tradition on our role as Jews and human beings to protect and nurture the natural world. The commandment to preserve nature is deeply woven into our identity. At the very beginning of the Torah in Genesis, Adam and Eve are commanded to work the Garden of Eden and to take care of it. Now, the rabbis in the commentary remind us that the key Hebrew words in this verse actually have quite precise meanings that translation doesn't maybe quite capture. La'avodah, normally to work, literally means to serve. L'shomra, to take care, really means to guard. So at the very beginning of our tradition, in the very first book of the Torah, as human beings are created, we are tasked with serving and guarding nature. We are taught we do not own the natural world, rather we are its stewards on behalf of God, or if not God, on behalf of future generations, and are duty bound to respect and preserve its integrity. But as we all know, we're collectively doing a terrible job. The latest IPCC report found that 20 warmest years in history were in the last 22. Wildlife populations have dropped by 2/3 since 1970. 400 million hectares of forest have been lost to deforestation since 1990. That's an area close to the size of Europe. Extreme weather events are today more and more frequent, from wildfires in California and Australia to hurricanes, typhoons, and flooding all around the world. And perhaps the scariest thing about all of this is that the impacts on our climate that we're seeing today are as a result of the warming to global temperatures caused by the fossil fuels that we burned in the 90s. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions and deforestation today, our climate will continue to change. We're going to see more extreme weather, more ice caps melting, more devastation to plants, wildlife, and communities. The only question is, can we stop it from getting even worse and literally prevent the end of life as we know it? Without significant reductions in emissions of about half every decade, much of our planet will be unlivable for human beings by the middle of the century, when many of us will be looking to retire. Just in London, for example, around 20% of our city will be underwater if we don't act fast. So we need to act, and my job at Deloitte is to help corporations think about the role they can play to help avert the worst of the climate crisis, to develop a vision for a more sustainable future and a roadmap to help them get there. So our starting point is to figure out what our clients actually want to achieve in terms of reducing their emissions. What is their ambition? So for example, this year I led some work with the BBC. They wanted to prepare for the new arrival of a new Director General and be ready with options for him for a new commitment on sustainability. So we work with each part of the corporation to explore what the emissions footprint looks like today and the feasibility of getting to zero, by when, and at what cost. This meant looking at their offices and facilities. Could they move to 100% renewable energy? Can they replace gas boilers with electric heaters or perhaps use biogas? Can they move their fleet of company cars to electric vehicles? Looking at how they do production, can they reduce international travel? Can they manage their use of resources on sets? Looking at technology, how can they power the service required to host all that content you stream on iPlayer and one of the most visited websites in the world? We took all of this together to paint a picture of what we thought it would take for the corporation to get to zero emissions and to build an actionable and costed roadmap. And last week, Director General Tim Davie announced on the BBC One show the results of our work and the BBC's new commitment to achieve net zero by 2030. Another example, we worked this year with AstraZeneca, one of the biggest companies in the world, and obviously top of the news agenda right now with the COVID vaccine. For AZ, the ask was less about helping to set an app, but to figure out how they could actually deliver it. Last year, their CEO made an incredibly bold commitment, which at the time was completely market leading. They committed to reducing their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to zero by 2025 and their Scope 3 emissions to carbon negative by 2030. If you're not familiar with the terminology, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol sets out a framework for tracking emissions. Scope 1 emissions are those that you directly produce, so the emissions coming out of your car, or for AZ, out of their batteries. Scope 2 are the carbon emissions that you would indirectly cause, primarily through the energy you purchased, so the emissions caused by the power station that provides your, in AstraZeneca's case, to their offices and facilities. And finally, Scope 3 emissions are those that you cause in others. So the emissions that result from the flights that you take or in the food that you buy. For AZ, their Scope 3 includes the emissions caused by the extraction of the raw materials that are used for medical products, from the lorries that distribute those products to pharmacies around the world, and to the electricity powering the laptops that their people use when they're working from home and on Zoom calls. So our work with AZ focused on Scope 1 and Scope 2. That's the operational emissions, not their value chain emissions. But that's not to diminish the challenge. Their operational emissions are about 30 times greater than those of the BBC, because AZ have a very complicated global operation with manufacturing facilities and offices all around the world that produce medicines, store them often at very cold temperatures, and often require very swift and sophisticated distribution. So to help them get to zero or understand how they could get to zero, we work with their operational teams and sites all over the globe to unpack what their footprint was, think about their choices in moving to zero by the 2025 deadline, and detail expected costs and develop a implementation roadmap for each. The big for AZ were things like how to heat a huge factory without a local source of biogas or a big enough electric heater, how to move to an electric vehicle fleet in countries where there's no charging infrastructure, what it means to move to a long-term commitment to purchase renewable energy when prices continue to fluctuate. As you no doubt can tell, I'm really proud of the work that I and my colleagues do at Deloitte and hope to do lots and lots more like it in the years to come. But what does this mean for you and for me as individuals, as citizens who care about the environment and want to fulfill our obligations to protect and preserve it? Well, first, I think we have reasons to be optimistic. Every single day, another brand, corporation, institution comes out with a commitment to sustainability. Literally just now, 10 minutes ago, President Biden signed an executive order to confront, in his words, the existential threat of climate change. It's in this environment that it's almost become passé for companies to declare a commitment to net zero, because it's just so common. And in fact, we're now moving into a world where to make a splash and engage your investors or your employees or others, companies are having to take even bolder steps to commit to issues beyond carbon, such as water, as Miriam's going to talk about later, and biodiversity and farming, as Adam will too. So we're seeing a cultural shift. Another project I'm working on at the moment exemplifies this moment. I'm working with David Attenborough and their teams to run the Earthshot Prize, an annual effort to find and promote the next big ideas for sustainability. The nominations we're getting through are amazing, and the stories we're going to be able to tell are really exciting and hopeful and truly optimistic. And meanwhile, opinions out there are changing. More and more people are recognizing that a lifestyle predicated on the use of natural resources as if they were infinite just isn't possible anymore. The UN came out with a new study on this huge shift in public opinion on this issue around the world. The organizations that we interact with every single day are taking steps to reduce their impacts on the environment. Just from the conversations I'm involved with at work, I am certain that we'll all be living in will soon be very different. We're talking to supermarkets about climate labeling on food, to network providers about how 5G can be used in farms and cities to tackle emissions and be combined with blockchain to track material use and waste. We talk to banks and insurers about focusing their investments on climate positive organizations. And of course, with COP26 looming later this year, governments are increasingly focused on climate as an issue. So there's lots to be done, but the future is hopeful. So to return to Genesis and to the Torah, the Midrash says that God showed Adam around the Garden of Eden and said, "Look at my works. See how beautiful they are. How excellent. For your sake, I created them all. See to it that you just do not spoil and destroy my world. For if you do, there will be no one else to repair it." That has to be our task, to make sure we leave the world in a better state for future generations. It just so happens today is my daughter's third birthday, so I'm very mindful of the world I want them to grow up in. And that's why I'm keen to finish with my two-ish fat resolution. I've got a few, actually. First of all, I want to get an electric car. Second, I want to have even more of these conversations, talk to more people about these issues, which sometimes can seem a bit worthy, a bit trite, but are literally the most important conversation we can be having right now. And finally, I want to be continuing to talk about this with JW3. And that is why I love JW3 so much. JW3 represents the place for our community to come together to talk about all the great and positive things about being Jewish and about how we can be a better, happier, thriving community enriched by our heritage, our culture, and hopefully our environment. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Rafi, for kicking us off and giving us an insight into what it looks like to go to net zero emissions with companies, with large-scale institutions that we wouldn't necessarily know how that works. And having an insight into this is so important. And for framing what you were saying in Jewish teaching as well. If you're just joining us now, welcome. You can catch up later on our Facebook and YouTube channels. But next up, we've got Rebecca Perlman. Rebecca's experience as a corporate and charities lawyer at Herbert Smith Freehills is extensive, and she'll be sharing about how her work as a lawyer focuses on environmental, social, and governance matters, and how that contributes to the wider discussion. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Joe. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the discussion and celebration of Tu B'Shvat, and thank you also to JW3 for the invitation to join this amazing panel. As Joe said, my name is Rebecca Perlman, and I'm a corporate lawyer at global law firm Herbert Smith Freehills, where I specialize in advising clients on environmental, social, and governance issues, or ESG issues for short. I have a particular focus on an area called impact investing, by which I mean investments in businesses that seek to generate a specific and measurable positive social or environmental impact alongside a financial return. Or put it more simply, doing well by doing good. So I've been working in this area for quite some time, long before it became a mainstream trend. And I wanted to spend the next few minutes just talking a bit about why businesses, investors, and lenders are paying more attention to environmental and social factors today, and why they're implementing the sorts of approaches that Rafi just outlined. So perhaps to start off with, I guess it's worth noting that ESG is a very broad concept, and it covers a wide range of issues. So from matters related to climate change, biodiversity, and resource depletion in the E category, to social issues relating to human rights, health and safety, and worker well-being in the S category, as well as governance matters such as executive pay and diversity in the G category. Environmental factors, and particularly climate change, certainly attracted the most attention in the months leading up to the outbreak of COVID-19. However, what's interesting is that the pandemic has in many ways refocused the existing dialogue around ESG by drawing the social factors like human rights and worker welfare out from the shadow of the E and the G and really rebalancing that conversation. In the past couple of years, we're seeing increased pressure from activists, consumers, voters, and investors, together with a progression in social norms in areas such as diversity, inclusion, and equality. And all of this is combining to push ESG and sustainability up the agenda. On top of this, the pandemic has emphasized the symbiotic relationship between business on the one hand and society on the other. And that's led to a lot of businesses revisiting their corporate purpose in this new context. So where ESG issues may have historically been viewed through more of an ethical or a moral lens, and therefore they were commonly seen as being dilutive to financial value, this has now fundamentally changed. And we can see a growing acknowledgement that ESG considerations are financially material and that sustainable business practices are not only essential from a risk management perspective, they're also often accretive. Given that, the finance sector in particular has woken up to the fact that all economic activity ultimately depends upon a healthy natural world. Even before COVID struck, regulators had already started taking significant steps to try to align financial markets with longer-term sustainable outcomes. And with calls across the globe to build back better, this remains a major priority for governments looking to generate a green recovery from the pandemic, as Rafi mentioned earlier. So we're continuing to see ESG-related laws passed in the UK, in Europe, increasingly now in the US, of course, and in Asia and even Australia. And these laws are requiring businesses, investors, and lenders to be much more transparent, both about the impact that they're having on society and the environment, and conversely, also the impact that issues like climate change will have on their businesses. So how will their businesses cope in a world with higher temperatures, with challenges around access to water, the extreme weather patterns that Rafi mentioned, and the social issues that will be caused by these physical environmental risks? So since 2018, there's been an absolute proliferation of ESG-related regulatory measures. In fact, 180 of them have been proposed globally, which is more than in the previous 6 years combined. Broadly speaking, the proposed regulations under these sorts of frameworks look at ESG issues through the lens of corporate conduct, transparency, and investor protection, and will have major implications for investors and corporates across the world. So I think it's safe to say that it is definitely a very busy time to be a lawyer in this space. Although businesses operating in developed economies have been regulated in related areas like health and safety, environmental matters, and employment issues for many years, the key difference now is that these obligations are also increasingly being accompanied by reporting requirements that seek to drive greater transparency. So essentially, they're requiring businesses to publish details of the ways in which they have considered and dealt with environmental, social, and governance issues. And this in turn is leading to greater levels of litigation as it becomes easier for NGOs and other activists to scrutinize corporate behavior. But it's not just the legal landscape which is causing businesses and those investing in them and lending to them to focus on these issues. I mentioned that there is a growing body of evidence which suggests that ESG factors can be financially material, and therefore that ESG integrated investment portfolios may be able to provide better returns to investors in the long run. Interestingly, I read the other day that recent analysis by BlackRock has suggested that companies with higher ESG ratings performed better than other companies during the upheaval in the first quarter of 2020. I think part of this story, it's also being driven by shifting consumer preferences. Younger generations in particular care about where their products have come from, how have those products got there, and what that means from a carbon footprint perspective. They also care about how those products have been made. So I'm just thinking about the uproar following the recent Boohoo scandal regarding their label standards. And these drivers are fundamentally the reason that businesses are introducing the standards and the processes that Rafi mentioned earlier. They are the reason why companies are linking their executive remuneration to environmental, social, and governance targets, like reducing carbon emissions. And they're also the reason behind recent statements published by asset managers, including the largest asset manager in the world, BlackRock, saying that no issue ranks higher than climate change on our clients' list of priorities. I think there are huge challenges and opportunities ahead as the world transitions to a low carbon economy. And the way in which we make that transition will have potentially far-reaching consequences for the most vulnerable in society in particular. But whatever your view is on how and at what pace we make the transition, It's safe to say that we've now reached a point where businesses and financial markets recognize that this is the new paradigm. And as Mark Carney has put it, businesses that embrace this reality will thrive, and those who fail to do so will cease to exist. So with all of that in mind, I think my Tu B'Shvat resolution for the environment is to best help my clients, be they small social enterprises or large multinational corporates, to help them understand the risks and opportunities posed by the ESG agenda, and ultimately to help them contribute to becoming a cleaner and a fairer planet.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that insight into ESG, environmental, social, and governance matters, and where law fits within that. It's incredible to hear how businesses have woken up and recognized that this is a new paradigm that affects the success of their business. But it's also really wonderful to hear that these aspects, the E, the S, the G, are interrelated, and what our future looks like will deeply affect social issues within our society, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. We've heard a couple of New Year's resolutions from our speakers, Tu B'Shvat, New Year for Trees resolutions. And if you have something you want to take on to improve the environment, chuck us a comment in the Facebook or the YouTube feed. You never know, it may inspire someone else to do something good too. Next up, we've got Rabbi Daniel Lichman. He teaches at Makor Chaim Community and will share what it means to look at the environmental crisis through a theological lens. Welcome, Rabbi Daniel.
Okay, apologies. I'm sorry, I was just mute. But here I am. Thanks, Joe, for introducing me and for putting on this event. It's great to mark Tu B'Shvat together in this way, with reflecting on the climate crisis, our relationship with trees, and resolutions for this year. So in my work as a rabbi, my job is to offer spiritual and theological teachings that can help us respond in this moment. I really honor the work that Rafi and Rebecca spoke about them doing. We're going to hear later from Miriam, Adam, and Shulamit, all people who are doing important work out there in the world, making a contribution on this. My thoughts are going to be more about our kind of inner life and how we respond to what's happening in the outer world inside, and how that conditions our relationship with the natural world and what response that offers. Because underneath this climate crisis, there's actually a spiritual crisis. So any solution to the climate crisis, so there isn't a solution, any ability to understand how we're going to adapt to this moment is going to require us to do deep spiritual soul searching and re-understanding what our priorities are and what matters to us. Really going deep. What is the nature of the human being on the earth? What's our relationship with it? And it's great that we started off with thoughts from Rafi, taking us back to Bereshit. That's the question that's called for. What is our nature as human beings and our relationship to the planet? What is our purpose with it? So I'm going to offer a tapestry of a few interconnected teachings that will offer a way of reflecting on this spiritual crisis and what we do in it. Firstly, I'm just reflecting on the importance of feeling. So we heard earlier from Rafi about the statistics, the facts, what's out there. We heard about how we've had the 20 warmest years in history within the last 22 years. When I heard that, I kind of felt a bit numb, felt a bit abstract to me. We heard about wildlife populations dropping by a third. I'm kind of desensitized to hearing about that. We've been hearing about this for a few years, for a long time. Yeah, it was kind of like it was hard. I didn't have a feeling response. We heard about how 18 million acres of forest lost to deforestation. Again, I have a feeling of hearing it before. So instead, what I want to suggest and offer to myself and to all of you is to take one of these and pause afterwards. What would it be like to actually feel the impact of these statements and to feel what the impact is on nature in the world and on other human beings, and what the cost is going to be into the future? It's really hard to actually pause and take this in, because there's going to be lots of defenses that we have internally to stop ourselves feeling the magnitude of this. So in this, I turn to Jewish tradition and the spiritual technology we have to enable us to actually face up to and feel reality. And the feeling of it is vital if we're going to make the transformations that we need. So in our tradition, we have Tisha B'Av. We have a day of lament, where we learn to practice lamenting in order for us to know what to do in moments of crisis, in order for us to know how to express grief, and it's through grief that we can better face reality. I'm really impressed by Extinction Rebellion Jews, where for the last couple of years, they've marked Tisha B'Av, understanding the destruction of the temple as the destruction of the sacred earth, the destruction that we're doing to the planet, and the impact that's having on other human beings and the suffering. And it's through grief, through tears, through the lament that we can face reality. So let's just try this in a moment. I'm just going to say a couple of those things again, and let's just pause and see if we take a moment just to feel whether we're able to find a kind of feeling response. Yeah, so we heard about wildfires in California and Australia. Many people losing their homes, forced out of their homes, forests being destroyed. The wildlife populations dropping by 2/3 since 19. I think it paused for a moment. Okay, great.
Wait one sec, Daniel. You're back now.
Okay, great, fantastic. Apologies for that delay. I'm not sure where I got up to, but I'll go to the next thought. So it's aware that the climate crisis is driven by consumption, by the ways in which we human beings have been consuming objects, consuming experiences, burning fossil fuels to fuel our addiction to things. So it's worth thinking about the relationship between why we consume things and what the spiritual crisis is underneath that. So I'd say that it's about desire and our relationship with desire. When we experience desire, we can experience that as a lack, a sense that we don't have something that we desire and we need that thing. That desire becomes suffering, a sense that we must remove the suffering. And maybe that thing if I get that thing, if I consume that thing, it means I'll stop suffering. So what I've just described there is addiction. And it's addiction to all kinds of different things that's led to the crisis that we're in, the addiction that we human beings have for things. But it doesn't have to be that way. This has been conditioned by our culture, by moments in history, by philosophical ways of thinking. And this is our tradition talks about this clearly in the second paragraph of the Shema. It talks about what happens when we wander off seeking, when our desire runs away with us and we seek to fulfill it through consumption. Instead, what I would want to offer us is to think about mitzvot as an alternative to that. Mitzvot, whether that be Shabbat, Kashrut, honoring your parents. In some way, I want to suggest that mitzvot teach us about desire. They help us to get to know desire, to honor desire, and to have a sense of how and where to channel that in some way. So what I want to invite us to do is to reorient in our Jewish lives our observance of mitzvot. What would it be like to re-understand Shabbat as part of a consumption addiction recovery program? How could we understand all of our mitzvot in some ways, contributing to the consciousness change that's required for us to address this spiritual crisis? Another thing I've been thinking about is how part of consuming things only happens because we think of things as objects that can be consumed. We can only destroy and cut down forests when we understand that they're objects where we can do that with in an unsustainable way. So there was a moment in the past where human beings didn't do this, where we understood nature to be infused with the spirit, to be something sacred in and of itself, where we could be in relationship with it and use it in some way, in a sustainable way, but with a kind of honoring and a respect. And what we had is what some sociologists or philosophers think of as, in Western society, as a moment of disenchantment, a moment where the natural world stopped being enchanted with the spirit, it stopped being sacred, and then it became something to be used. So I want to invite us in the spiritual lives, in the way that we relate to nature, to objects, to return to a sense of enchantment. And in this, I feel the spirit of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav hovering over this kind of teaching. So much of his Torah is about seeing the ways in which plants and the sun and the moon are all alive and in praise of God when we daven. When we daven with the trees are also davening. So what would it be like for us to take our davening practice, which I mean any of our spiritual practice, or to build spiritual practices into our life, where we orient towards understanding that we're connecting with other parts of nature that are also doing this. The challenge of this is that so many of us have grown up within a scientific materialist worldview, where everything that happens in objects can be explained through science in some way. And that, in many ways, kind of limits, has blocked us off from being able to just be in a relationship of awesomeness and understanding the miracle of what's happening in every moment. So, so one of the things that can help us with this is children. So children naturally are able to orient towards the world as a miraculous, awesome place full of questions to be explored. So we can relearn from children how to be in the world with a sense of wonderment, and how to re-enchant the world as we do that. So I'm going to close with ideas about a Tu B'Shvat resolution, a New Year resolution for trees. So what I want to suggest is, in this New Year for trees, I want to invite my resolution for myself is that I seek to cultivate an inner life where I can feel, where I can face up to the terror of actually of the impact of the climate crisis, to face up to that fear, and through facing up to it and grieving through that in some way, to be able to be open more to the reality of the climate crisis. And through that, and to practice at the same time loving nature and experience immense joy, to absolutely balance any grieving with the joy of being connected with nature, of the possibility of davening with the trees, with the animals. So this New Year for trees, may you daven with the oak tree, and in loving relationship with the earth and one another, we'll be able to dance through this crisis together.
Thank you for that, Rabbi Daniel. It was incredibly beautiful, and I think it's so important to think about reorienting ourselves through the Jewish rituals, festivals, and times of the year that we have already, to feel more deeply and in awe of nature. I think that's something that a lot of people have been experiencing, at least in some small way, from appreciating what's around them in this particular moment. So thank you so much. If you're enjoying this event, check out our Young JW3 Facebook group to keep up to date with everything that's going on over the next few months. It's a really wonderful space that we check in and make sure that everyone knows what's happening at Young JW3. We have got 3 more fantastic speakers coming up tonight. And our next one is a friend of mine, Miriam Westbrook, but more importantly, she is a senior consultant for Ricardo Energy and Environment, working in the field of water management. And she's going to share a little bit about the place of water in our environmental activism and work.
Sorry, I was muted again. Hi, try again. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Joe, and to JW3 for inviting me tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work as a consultant in the water industry. I'm a senior consultant for a company called Ricardo Energy and Environment, and we work on projects across the environmental field, including things like air quality, sustainable transport, carbon and waste. But I work on water, and water is really key to sustaining life, not just ours, but every living thing. So it's really important and sometimes overlooked aspect of environmental protection. A lot of the work that I do is at the interface between the water industry, that's the companies that are responsible for providing our drinking water and taking away our wastewater, and protection of the water environment, our rivers, our lakes, the oceans and groundwaters that support so many important habitats and species. Water companies have 2 often competing responsibilities: to provide clean, safe drinking water to their customers and to protect the water environment that our water resources depend on. For example, most of the drinking water for London comes from rivers like the River Thames and others, and it's taken out of those rivers and piped into large reservoirs in the west and in the north of London. You might notice these reservoirs when you drive to Heathrow. They're enormous, around the M4 and the M25, and they provide most of our drinking water in London. But those rivers and reservoirs aren't just there to provide us with water. They're also home to some of our most protected biodiversity. Rivers are also used for navigation by boats. They can provide a source of food through the fisheries they sustain, and they can even take in and store carbon and other air pollutants through the activities of the plants that live in the water. Water sources also support our physical well-being by providing spaces for recreation, and also our mental health and mental well-being by providing those spaces in nature for our enjoyment, and as Rabbi Daniel was talking about, taking joy in the natural environment. For example, Raisbury Reservoir in Staines is the second largest water storage facility in London. It's really important for providing our water, our drinking water as Londoners, as I am a Londoner, especially during drought. But it's also a site of special scientific interest, and it's a special protection area protected by law for the population of rare birds that use it as a refuge during the winter. And Thames Water, who manage the reservoir, are responsible for managing both the needs of the people of London who need water to drink, water to flush their toilets, wash their hair, water their lawns, with the needs of the other users of the reservoir, the great crested grebe and the wintering cormorant. Buell Water, another example of a really important water resource in Kent. It's one of the largest inland bodies of water in the south of England and provides most of the drinking water for Kent and East Sussex. And it holds enough water to provide an average day's water use for nearly 200 million people. But it's not just a water source, not just a source of drinking water. It's also a major recreational site. As well as supporting important wildlife, it's a popular lake for fishing, for sailing, for walking, and you can even have your wedding there. Southern Water, who manage it, have an equal responsibility to use Buell for drinking water and to maintain it as a key social asset. The projects I work on often involve helping water companies plan how to manage this balance, but it's going to get a lot harder as we move into an increasingly uncertain climate future. There's still a lot that we don't know about how the future climate will change in the UK, but we do know some things with quite a lot of certainty. One, that population is going to increase, and that means more people drinking more water, taking more baths, flushing more toilets. And it also means a greater demand for things that require water to make them, and that's pretty much anything you can imagine. One of the obvious ones being food. All our food uses water to grow, but the clothes we wear, the technology we use, the fuel we put in our cars, all of that takes water to produce. So more people, more demand for water. Another thing we know is that water resources are expected to decrease under climate change, and DEFRA have estimated a decline of between 10 and 45% of water available for our use by 2050. That's an enormous risk to the water that we have available for essential life. And that's not equal, because in the south of England, we're already considered to be water scarce. London gets less rain every year, although it might not seem like it. It gets less rain on an average year than Rome or Istanbul or Sydney. And droughts are expected to get more severe in the future, which means greater threats to people and the environment. We know how to manage the fact that we have less water in the summer than in the winter, but what we don't know is when a drought is going to strike and how severe it's going to be. And it's very hard to plan for that. And we're expecting that those are going to get more frequent and more severe in future. In periods of drought, water companies are allowed to take temporary measures which can harm the environment to ensure continued supply of drinking water. So, for example, by taking more water out of the river than would be sustainable for the fish that live there. And it's only on a temporary basis, but because humans in our legislation take precedent. And that means that that threat to the water environment becomes more severe the more we experience severe droughts. But, you know, it sounds quite bleak. And sometimes when we think about the environment in general, it can be quite depressing. But we are taking steps to manage these risks. Water companies, governments and consultants are working hard to change the way we manage water to make sure there will be enough for people and for nature into the future. We're doing this in a number of ways, but primarily using technology that's been developed in water scarce countries like Israel are being developed in the UK to increase the amount of water that we can provide. Things like desalination, which once upon a time would only be used in sort of desert countries, are now being planned in the UK. Water recycling and improving the treatment technologies that we have access to also means we can treat more polluted water more quickly and more efficiently using less energy. And that will help us to provide more water in future. Secondly, water companies have started working together across regions and across the UK to plan water resources more effectively. So up until now, water companies were responsible just for managing their own patch, with some interrelationships at the boundaries, but mainly just the patch that they're responsible for. But they've realised that's not working. The southeast of England has very little water, and places in the north and the west of England have loads of water. So they're now working together to plan how they can manage that more effectively through things like big, large-scale transfer pipelines. And planning at the regional and country scale also means that our money as customers is spent in the most effective ways to supply water where it's needed the most. Water companies are also being asked by the Environment Agency to develop what they call environmental destinations. These are a vision of what a sustainable future looks like. And companies have to make sure that their plans will help to achieve this. Instead, in the past, water companies would look at supply options and choose the cheapest. And that's because customers care about how much their bills are. But customers increasingly will care about what their environment looks like and how safe their water supply is for the future. And now companies are being asked to take that as seriously as they are the cost today. Lastly, UK policy is changing to support sustainable futures. The government a few years ago published its 25-year environment plan, and it set out the ambition that we will leave our environment in a better state than we found it. And that's not just a soundbite. That will be enshrined into law soon by the Environment Bill, which is expected this year. And one aspect of this is that all developers and planners, including water companies, will have to deliver environmental net gain. That means any major strategies or developments will need to prove that they're going to improve the state of the environment compared to how it is today. So if you're going to cut down 5 trees to build a pipeline, you need to plant 10 more so that your overall contribution is positive. And in this way, water companies will be contributing to leaving the environment in a better state than we found it. We can all contribute as consumers to protecting the water environment by reducing the amount of water we consume as individuals. So for my Tu B'Shvat resolution, I'm trying to cut down on the number of things that I buy new, bearing in mind how much water they take to make. So primarily clothes, cotton has a massive water footprint, but also things like books and furniture, so that less water is used in the manufacturing of things that I use. And in that way, I hope to keep reducing my own personal water footprint and contribute to a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that insight into the water industry. I think many of us only think of water when a pipe isn't working, or the shower's not working, or there's no hot water in our houses. And I think having that insight into the biodiversity that exists in a reservoir and how important that is, and how they're also stakeholders in the kind of discussion about water is really, really insightful. And I loved your resolution. It feels very manageable, and I think something that many of our audience members can take on in some way this year. So next up, we've got Adam Abadi. He's someone that I met on one of my government-sanctioned walks over the past few months, and I heard that he was an urban farmer, sustainability advocate, and visionary. And he'll be spending some time talking about his work at Israeli startup InFarm and its experience of farming in general. And hopefully he'll show us the vertical farm he's got growing in his own home. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you so much, Joe. Hi, everyone. I hope you're keeping well and healthy. So as Joe mentioned, I'll be briefly telling you about my work at InFarm and how together we help to improve the environment, and give you a little insight as to why vertical farming is in the top 3 trending industries now and will be moving forward. But to begin with, a word on Tu B'Shvat. So during Tu B'Shvat, we focus our attention towards the environment and environmental issues. Now, it's been said that the relationship between human beings and the earth is bound up in 2 words of Hebrew, Adam and Adama. The first means human being, and my name, and the second, earth. Now, the two words are connected to teach us that we are intertwined. Neither the earth nor human beings run independent of each other, and both are directly linked and have a drastic and long-lasting effect on one another. Now, for me, especially in my line of work, this message really resonated with me. I'd say my relationship with the earth rekindled about 2 years ago when I was in Australia working on farms out there. Now, I got into that line of work because for me, the work is honest, it's hands-on, and I find that extremely fulfilling. And you get to work in line with nature and its cycle. Out there, I was working on an industrial farm, and I was doing various tasks such as operating machinery and working with irrigation, fencing. And as much as I enjoyed the work, which turned out to be my newfound love and passion, I realized that there was still a long way for it to go, farming, and that there was a lot of negative impacts on the environment, which at its core really, really upset me. To name a few, water and land was being used in an abundance. And as Miriam very well said, water right now, under great restrictions worldwide, there's a shortage. And when it comes to land, as we all know, especially through our Jewish history, there's always been conflict over it. Moreover, a lot of fertilizers and pesticides were being used, and this has detrimental effects on the surrounding food chains, habitats, and chemical fertilizer runoffs are extremely dangerous. For example, in the US, as a result of these runoffs across the country, 80% of its seafood is imported, and that's because the surrounding habitats have been destroyed as a result of these agricultural runoffs. And last but not least, transportation. So I was working with a lot of machinery there, and to get on the farm and to get the crops from the farm to the markets in Australia took hours, absolutely hours, and sometimes you're stuck in traffic. So altogether, there was a high carbon footprint. Again, has negative impacts on our climate and greenhouse gases. So I knew that this is what I wanted to do, but I wanted to do it better. And I started doing research. So I was living in my van and I was doing a bit of research, how I can do this better in a more sustainable manner, especially when I come back to London. So I came across things like vertical farming and hydroponics and all these buzzwords online. And once I started reading the amazing figures and statistics on it, sustainable farming techniques had me caught, and I was drawn into it. So when I got back to London, I've managed to find work at 2 companies prior to InFarm that I want to quickly touch upon. So one was Square Mile Farm, where they have a farm at the top of a building in Paddington inside an old shipping container. And they were growing microgreens and leafy greens through hydroponics in the middle of London. It was fantastic. Next, I had a little stint at Growing Underground, who are very well known as they're utilizing an unused World War II air raid shelter from the 1940s. So every day I went to work, I'd go 30 meters below the ground, and they had a whole operation there pumping out microherbs to the surrounding community. And both these companies, as well as InFarm, were growing through a technique called hydroponics. To break down some terminology, so vertical farming, what does that mean? So it's the practice of growing food in vertically stacked layers, usually in an airtight space or a closed environment, so you can control all the variables. Now, traditionally in vertical farms, they'll grow through the means of hydroponics. What is hydroponics? So hydroponics is growing food without the use of soil in a nutrient-rich solution. And there are many benefits to this. So the benefits to growing within vertical in vertical farms is, as mentioned, you can now have full control, almost playing God, so to say. So that means you control the humidity, the temperature, the ventilation, the nutrients, the lighting, the complete environment. And as a result, you can control pests a lot better this way, and you get year-round production. So you can be producing food in areas that have food oases and places that struggle to grow year-round through regular agriculture techniques. So that's a bit on vertical farming and hydroponics. Now this leads me into InFarm. So InFarm were founded in 2013 by 3 Israelis, and they are based in Berlin. They've, through rapid expansion, they're now in over 9, I believe now 10 countries. They've just opened up in Japan, which is super exciting to see. And they have a fantastic business model, and one that is unique around the world. No other vertical farming company is using their business model. So what is their model? So they are effectively decentralizing the supply chain, and they are putting it in to your cities, into your neighborhoods. So it's around the corner to you. So what does this mean? Why is that so great? So you get to reduce food miles. You know, instead of going, instead of shipping your food and take your Italian basil, instead of shipping your Italian basil thousands of miles away from Italy, and it has to come on, it has to be harvested, taken to a packing station, taken to distribution, air freighted, cargo freighted, and then flown into London. You are able to cut that all out and effectively just have your food come from down the road, say North London, say Golders Green, or even my house. I've actually got an example here, which I'm quite excited to show you. So I've been growing this lettuce head hydroponically. As you see, it's got beautiful length. There's no soil here, and it grows fantastically. So it's just an example of how you can be growing locally, which reduces your food mileages. So what's the goal? What's InFarm's goal? So ultimately, their goal is to help cities become self-sufficient in their production, to grow food where it's consumed, and to farm directly where people live. And as mentioned, the benefits are reducing food miles. And if you're like growing underground and InFarm using warehouses and underutilized spaces, you get to repurpose them. So instead of destroying land, and instead of breaking past London's green belt, or for example, destroying more of the Amazon or an orangutan sanctuary, you get to reuse places. And perhaps from COVID, this could be more prevalent than ever, bearing in mind that so much office space is now being underused. So this is really exciting. A bit on my role quickly. So I'm part of an amazing team that include scientists, growers, and technicians, cloud-based technology to grow the food. The team all together are absolutely amazing. And all together in the past, including worldwide, InFarm, up until this day, InFarm have saved 35 million liters of water, 3.1 million kilometers of transportation, 49,000 square meters of farming land. And I think moving forward with a growing population up to 9 billion, we need to think of solutions on how we're going to find land or create land in order to meet the population's demand. And I'm truly passionate and a strong believer that vertical farming through the use of hydroponics will be the way forward to do this, growing food for the population in the most sustainable way possible. New Year's resolution is to just keep spreading awareness and the message, and letting people know the benefits to vertical farming and hydroponics, And if you have any further questions, please find me on Facebook or LinkedIn. I'd love to help you. And I'd love to talk about it. Thank you so much. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks so much, Adam. Having looked at the not worm, because this is hydroponics, work of InFarm, what they're doing online is pretty incredible. I've seen some of the plans that they have, and it's really exciting. And I think, as many of our speakers have let me know in the chat, that lettuce was clearly the highlight of the whole evening, and we really appreciate the insight into vertical farming and the work that you're doing. If you're joining us now towards the end, check out the rest of the event on JW3's Facebook page and YouTube afterwards, and make sure to join our Young JW3 Community Facebook group to keep up to date with all of our events and programs coming up. Our last speaker tonight is Shulamit Morris-Evans, an Extinction Rebellion activist. She co-founded Extinction Rebellion Jews a few months after a protest-related arrest, and she'll be sharing an argument for civil disobedience. Over to you, Shulamit.
Thank you so much, Joe. So we're all here tonight because of the power of our Jewish tradition to fortify and inspire us, and to give us an ethical mandate to take action against the climate and ecological emergency. So what does acting on that responsibility mean in the situation in which we find ourselves? And the Jewish community definitely is starting to engage. We have eco-synagogues, we have the Jewish Vegetarian Society, we have the wonderful Jewish farm Sadeh, which planted 150 trees this week. And I was particularly delighted to hear that the Board of Deputies will be voting on the 21st of February on whether to declare a climate emergency as a first step to concerted communal action. So I do beg anyone who has a deputy or is one to encourage as many of our communal representatives as possible to attend and, of course, vote in favour. But I'm here to represent another answer to that question of how we can act on the moral obligations the climate and ecological emergency places us under. And that is mass civil disobedience in general and Extinction Rebellion Jews in particular. So in arriving at the conviction that this is a key and necessary part of the suite of actions that this crisis demands of us, and we have heard some really inspiring examples of what other elements of that can be, I felt inexorably carried along by a sort of 5-point argument. And the first and most familiar is the scale and urgency of the issue. We've already heard about some of that. But just to kind of reiterate some of the key points, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has made it abundantly clear that we must remain below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. We are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius, and the amount of heat energy that presupposes is roughly equivalent to 5 atomic bombs going off every second. Just for some more context, global temperature is now the highest it's been for, global average temperature is now the highest it's been for 2 millennia, and the 2018 average for concentration of CO2 was 407 parts per million. For the last 800,000 years, that number hasn't been above 300. So we're in uncharted waters already. And that is very scary because we are on track to continue warming. And if we continue at the rate we're going, we could hit 1.5 by 2030. We could have reached 3 or even 4 by the end of the century. And at that point, it looks like the planet might not be able to hold more than 4 billion people, and the human impact of that catastrophe doesn't need dwelling upon. And we are familiar too with the litany of disasters that climate change brings in its train: the heat waves, the droughts, the forest fires, the storms and flooding, and their immediate traumatic impact. But I also just want to note, and I think particularly for a Jewish audience, it's worth remembering what those kind of stresses can do to the fabric of our civilization. And that is something that is a fear that very much drives me in this as well. So if that wasn't all depressing enough, just a final aspect of why this is not only a huge problem, but an extremely urgent one, and why such what some may seem as such extreme measures as breaking the law is appropriate, is the fact that what we're worried about is hitting certain tipping points. that could then create cascades that are unstoppable and self-reinforcing. So one example recently, just this week, we've had news that ice is melting in line with the worst case scenario predictions. And the reason that's a problem is because if you have ice on water that melts, it reveals dark water, which absorbs heat more than the reflective ice. And this is called the albedo effect, because then that extra warming melts the ice faster, and so on and so forth. So we may not have the opportunity that we have now to stop this ever again. And the results of failing to act now could be catastrophic in ways that we cannot even imagine. So this is why in our Jewish tradition, we have this sense of l'dor vador from generation to generation, and that is what is at stake. So another story that we have is a midrash from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that tells of passengers on a ship, one of whom begins to drill under their seat, and to the consternation of everyone else on board. And in reply to their frantic questions, the driller points out that it is only their own seat they're making a hole under. To which the horrified passengers, of course, will respond that the rising waters will drown them all too. And this ties into the fact that at this point in time, sadly, individual action is not enough. We don't have time for good-willed individuals to be independently making shifts to less meat-heavy diets and electric cars and so on, because of the pitch of urgency we are at. We need action from governments, coordinated global action. We have solutions, but they are not being put into practice. And this is the third point, is that the issue is not a dearth of solutions, it's a lack of political will. So if you look at something like Project Drawdown, there are lots and lots of solutions, but they're not being put into practice to the extent that they could be, because there isn't always the will to do so. And in generating that will, conventional modes of protest seem to have been insufficient. We've known about climate change for years. There have been international conferences on it for decades, and yet emissions have been rising, not just rising, but rising exponentially. We're at a curve of 1.65%. We've heard this month that the UK government is not stepping in to stop the UK's first deep coal mine in 30 years from being built at Whitehaven. We are clearly still living in a world in which politicians are not listening enough. And therefore, when we look at history and we see that peaceful civil disobedience has a track record of success, if you look at Gandhi, if you look at Martin Luther King, there is what to me seems an ineluctable moral force to the argument that we should consider engaging in civil disobedience. It is a last resort. It is extreme, but it does seem necessary. And for me, that also has a Jewish component. There are two shifras that inspire me in life. One is my wonderful little sister, and the other is the shifra of the Bible, who presents us with an example of civil disobedience in disobeying Pharaoh's orders to kill the Jewish baby boys. And it is this conviction that my Jewish identity reinforces that mandate to break the law if necessary, when it is morally incumbent upon us to do so, to save life, not just now, but in the future for untold numbers of years to come. It's this that leads me to be a part of Extinction Rebellion Jews, that led me to take part in an action that led to my arrest. And given that that impulse is a Jewish one, I wanted to express it Jewishly, and this is the reason for the genesis of Extinction Rebellion Jews. As Rabbi Daniel Lichman mentioned, there is a component of internal actions, one might call them, of recognizing and dealing with climate grief. And Extinction Rebellion as a whole is very much aware of that component and the need for regenerative practices to deal with that. But also, as well as sort of bringing Extinction Rebellion to the Jewish community in those ways and in other ways, raising awareness and giving talks, there's also an aspect of bringing Jews to the rebellions. These rebellions, these mass demonstrations of civil disobedience, have been very effective at raising awareness and creating the political pressure that we need, and encouraging our community to be a part of that feels incredibly important. So in April 2019, the first big rebellion, we held a climate Seder And there felt a huge symbolism in gathering outside Parliament, outside our country's seat of power, and retelling the story of a ruler who hardened his heart against clear warnings and thereby exposed his population to a crescendo of environmental disasters, which culminated in the most terrible of bereavements. And this is what we are seeking to avoid. And we use those rituals, the matzah, to represent different aspects of environmental degradation and both relate to it as we united ourselves to create that pressure on Parliament. Similarly, Sukkot came around and we had the October rebellion later that year, and my rabbi from my community was arrested, and this was a huge, very public moment and demonstration of the logic that I've been talking about. But as well as these very serious and somber actions, we also held a klezmer in the streets, and the pride of being openly Jewish in our climate activism is very empowering, and I think that there can be joy to it that I am keen to express so that everyone can hold on to that. And similarly, in September, just gone, to herald the arrival of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, we were outside Parliament once again, praying, and not just with other Jews, but with people from other faiths. And that note of partnership is what I want to end on, because civil disobedience is not a panacea. It is one tool that I feel we must use, but we also must use that in conjunction with others. And the Climate and Ecological Bill is a collaborative effort. We are in lockdown currently. We do not have the same options as we might have had under ordinary circumstances. But my New Year's resolution for trees, my Tu B'Shvat resolution, is to encourage the Jewish community to put pressure on their MPs to support the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. Extinction Rebellion Jews will be holding an event also on the 21st of February to encourage letter writing. And I would like to just leave you with that reminder of those words. It's not up to you to finish the work. This is a huge task, but neither are you free to walk away from it. This is the most urgent act of tikkun olam that has ever been required of us. And with these terrifying climate deadlines looming large on the horizon, never has it been more truly spoken. If not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shulamit, for being our last and final speaker this evening and explaining how Jewish teaching informs your activism and your civil disobedience. It's really insightful, and thank you. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and happy Tu B'Shvat. We hope you've learned a little more about the wide variety of ways that you can get involved and improve our environment through many, many diverse ways. And JW3 is a place that engages with diverse ways of being Jewish as well as kind of improving the environment. And our new series, Denomination, is coming out next Monday, 8:30 p.m., exploring the Jewish denominational landscape and smashing stereotypes about other Jewish communities. Please join us then, and we'll hear from various different young rabbis about their denominations. I can't let this evening pass without noting that today we marked Holocaust Memorial Day. We think about the contrasting themes of these 2 days, and we pray that through celebrating Jewish festivals like this one, we can sow seeds of hope and love in the world around us to avoid future genocides like the Holocaust. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. Please like our Facebook page and our YouTube page for more events and programs from JW3. Good night.